Shortly. It's already been an eventful day here in Brussels, one that could be potentially a turning point for the NATO alliance and the war in Ukraine, which is now entering its second month. Hard to believe what's going on. So far, President Biden and the NATO leaders, they have discussed what they would do potentially if Russia deploys chemical, biological, or God forbid, even tactical nuclear weapons to deal with this issue in Ukraine. The White House announced also today new sanctions against hundreds of Russian lawmakers and oligarchs. We're watching that unfold. The president is also pledging that the United States will accept, this is very important as well, up to 100,000 Ukrainian refugees into the United States, up to 100,000 Ukrainian refugees into the United States. This past year, the U.S. accepted less than 100,000 refugees from all over the world. This is a major development as well. We're watching all of this as the U.S. has formally declared that Russian forces are committing war crimes in Ukraine, an official legal statement from the U.S. State Department. President Biden will hold a news conference here after all these deliberations have concluded. We'll, of course, have live coverage coming up. But let's begin our coverage this hour with CNN's chief White House correspondent, Caitlin Collins. She's with me here at NATO headquarters. Caitlin, let's talk a little bit about what we're learning. I know you're doing some excellent reporting on this. What have you learned that has actually taken place so far behind closed doors? One of the most notable things is right now they are in their second summit of the day. This is the time it's with the G7 leaders. Those are, of course, those industrialized nations. President Biden is preparing to leave here at NATO to go to his third meeting of the day. All of these focused around Ukraine. And Ukraine's President Zelensky has addressed them twice now. First, of course, virtually on the video conference as they met with the NATO leaders earlier this morning. Then he addressed the G7 leaders as well. And he has a very clear message, which is that Ukraine needs help from these NATO allies, from the G7 leaders. More help than what they've gotten so far, though he has thanked them for the support that they've gotten so far. He is still calling on, saying that Ukraine needs more jets. They need more fighter jets. They need more tanks. He is calling on them, saying, you have thousands of fighter jets. Ukraine has not gotten one of those. We do still need those. And that comes as the United States and other allies here are talking about the efforts that they've taken to try to bolster Ukraine as they have fought back against this Russian invasion, something that they have noted of course, that they have done. They've also talked about the humanitarian aspect of this, Wolf, and the efforts to try to help there. And in that sense, there is a really big announcement coming out of the United States, which is that they are prepared to accept up to 100,000 Ukrainian refugees in this amid this crisis. Of over 3.5 million about have fled Ukraine since the invasion started a month ago. And coming out of this, President Biden noted that he believes NATO is more united now than ever. He says they have a lot to talk about between now and the next time these NATO leaders are scheduled to meet, Wolf. That's in June, of course. And one thing we do expect President Biden to talk about is the efforts to bolster the NATO forces in Eastern Europe. Those are those countries right there on the border of Ukraine, the border of Russia, that are obviously very threatened right now by Russia and by its aggression. And so we have seen they've already deployed more U.S. troops to the area, more NATO forces to the area, and now they are planning to do even more, Wolf. It's interesting. Natasha Bertrand is here at NATO headquarters as well. She's inside. And Natasha, I know you've got some more reporting on what these NATO leaders heard today from President Zelensky.
That's right, Wolf. So it was more of a plea for NATO to do more to save lives inside Ukraine. This is what Zelensky has been asking for the last several weeks, of course. He had been asking previously for NATO to implement a no-fly zone over the country, but interestingly, he did not ask for that today. He did stop just short as well of asking for NATO membership. He said that Ukraine has more than proven itself, its military has more than proven itself to be capable of joining the NATO alliance, but that NATO now has to prove itself. And we are also hearing more from Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO chief, who gave a press conference here earlier today, and he was asked, specifically about the idea that NATO is going to put additional forces on a more permanent basis on that NATO eastern flank, just because of how close the war has gotten to their borders. And he would not answer that question directly, but he did say that NATO forces are essentially preparing for the long haul here, preparing for a long-term security presence, given the clear and present threat that Russia poses to the NATO alliance and to Europe. Here's what he said.
And today we decided on 4 new battle groups. and the leaders agreed to task our military commanders to provide options for a long-term reset of our presence, our military posture in the eastern part of the alliance and across the whole alliance. President Putin's invasion of Ukraine has changed our security environment for the long term. It's a new reality, it's a new normal, and NATO is responding for the long term.
So this just underscores, Wolf, the extent to which the NATO summit today was really about protecting NATO, right? I mean, obviously sending additional equipment and weaponry to Ukraine was top of the agenda, but the real reason for today's meetings was about what can NATO do to protect themselves given this brand new, very, very challenging, they say, security environment in Europe. Wolf.
Natasha, stand by. You know, Caitlin, you've been getting some new reporting on this so-called Tiger team that the U.S. has put together to deal with this horrible contingency of Russia using chemical, biological, or God forbid, nuclear weapons.
And what this is basically a group of national security officials inside the administration. They're called a Tiger team. They had formed a version of this back in the fall when they thought Russia might invade Ukraine, to prepare for what that would look like. Clearly that paid off, given that has actually happened. And now 4 days we are learning after the invasion started, they authorized another version of it, which this time it is focusing on if Putin takes the extreme step of deploying chemical weapons, biological weapons, maybe even these tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. How does the U.S. respond to that? Obviously, that's something they'd want to do in consultation with the allies here that the president is meeting with today, but they want to know, what are the options? What are we likely to do here? What would warrant potentially a military response, given that's been something that President Biden has said is off the table? And what we're hearing is that they've really looked at every aspect of this, Wolf, not just maybe if there's a chemical weapons attack. What do they do if Russia targets a U.S. convoy providing that military aid to Ukraine? What if they go after the humanitarian efforts that are underway here? They are exploring all of those aspects of this because they want to be prepared. And I think one thing that really stood out to me about this reporting that we did is that they tasked this for the next 3 months ahead. That is how long they're prepared for this to potentially last. Of course, we know it could go on much longer than that. It really remains to be seen. And so it just gives you kind of some insight into what's happening behind the scenes at the White House as they are trying to prepare themselves for any contingency plans of whatever it is Putin may do here.
And it's interesting, Natasha, because not just the U.S. unilaterally, but we heard from Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, saying that NATO as a whole is also focusing in on these horrible contingencies.
That's exactly right. So the possibility here that a chemical weapons attack might be launched by Russia, or any kind of attack using a weapon of mass destruction inside Ukraine, has been really top of mind for the NATO alliance, because, of course, the question then is, what is the moral imperative, and, of course, the imperative in order to defend the rest of Europe and the NATO alliance in that instance. Of course, NATO Secretary Jens Stoltenberg did say that there is the possibility here that if such a weapon were deployed in Ukraine, then it could actually spill over into the rest of the alliance. And would that then trigger a response by NATO, a fulsome response, or would it just trigger a coalition of the willing, so to speak, a couple of countries who decide that that has gone just too far and they have to respond? So I think that this is obviously a major part of their contingency planning here, because they understand that when Russia accuses other countries of doing something, it usually means, in their minds, that Russia is planning to do it themselves. And they have seen that Russia has set the stage here to accuse the United States and Ukraine of launching such attacks. And they are prepared for Vladimir Putin to take such steps, knowing that he has already essentially done so, right? We saw that he had poisoned a dissident on UK soil, for example, using the chemical nerve agent Novichok. I mean, these are things that they don't believe would be out of the realm of possibility here. But the question is, what is the red line for NATO? And that is just something that they are not prepared to discuss at the moment. They are trying to keep it deliberately ambiguous to keep Vladimir Putin on his toes.
You know, and Caitlin, it's also significant. I've covered a lot of these kinds of summits over the years, but this is really historic, what's going on right now. The president, he brings his Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, He brings his Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, his National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, and a whole bunch of other senior officials here to Brussels to participate in these talks.
Absolutely, because that is all part of this response. A lot of this, what we're just talking about, these plans, these contingency plans, that involves the State Department and the Pentagon, obviously. And so one interesting thing that we did hear from the Pentagon spokesman, John Kirby, when you two were speaking earlier and you were interviewing him, he talked about the lack of communication between senior U.S. officials and senior Russian officials, saying basically that Russian defense officials are not picking up the phone when the United States calls right now. That doesn't mean there's no communication happening. They do have this deconfliction line where if they needed to check on something when it comes to airspace, they could talk in that manner. But they're saying that when they call these senior Russian defense officials, they are not answering. And I think that really underscores just how far apart these two sides are here. I mean, the gulf, of course, between them since this invasion has started. And it raises a lot of concerns because the less insight you have, that is not good for the United States, especially when we're talking about two nuclear powers here. And so that's a big concern, I think, for the White House right now. And it does show a lot of concern about what is happening inside Russia and the concerns that they have there.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It's very significant that when the Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin calls his Russian counterpart, or the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, calls his Russian counterpart, they don't answer the phone, they don't return the calls. It just goes silent right now, and that's a worrisome development as well. We're following all these developments. Caitlin, thank you. Natasha, thanks to you as well. Don't go too far away. There's going to be breaking news, I'm sure, over the next several hours as we're watching all of this unfold. Also coming up, a lot of new developments in the war in Ukraine, including these powerful images of a Russian warship being destroyed in southern Ukraine. Stay with us. Our special coverage continues right after this.
African Voices Changemakers, in association with Glow Unlimited.
Afrochella is an annual celebration in December that highlights Africa's diverse and vibrant culture.
What we simply want to do is be able to communicate culture through food, art, music, and fashion. Because these, we feel, are simple connectors that people can find consensus on, or people that can connect with. Each pocket has their own fans of people that they enjoy. And then there's people like me that enjoys all four. And when I'm in Afrochella, or if someone is like me and they're in Afrochella, it's like they're mini heaven on earth.
Co-founder Abdul Karim Abdullah says his connection to the continent runs deep.
I grew up in both New York City and the Bronx, and I also grew up here in Accra. My parents wanted me to have a very authentic experience here, so they left us in Medina Zongo.
This is CNN. More people get their news from CNN than any other news source.
Acai bowls. They're a popular breakfast and also Instagrammable, but big question, are they healthy? Well, acai bowls are made from pureed acai berries, then topped with fruit. So it's basically a smoothie in a bowl. And acai berries are rich in antioxidants, and most acai bowls will be high in fiber and vitamin C. Since acai is naturally bitter, many restaurants and those pre-made frozen mixes use a sweetened powdered acai. So go easy on the sugary toppings like granola, chocolate, sweetened coconut, and honey. Instead, try berries and chia seeds as a topping. And adding Greek yogurt to your bowl is a good way to add protein to the meal, and it will keep you full longer. Bottom line, acai bowls can be a great way to add fruit to your diet, but watch your portion size, and remember, all those toppings make it easy to go overboard on calories and sugar.
Our mission here at CNN. The news comes first. More breaking news that we are following right now. Welcome to the Situation Room. We have breaking news.
world's biggest business stories. From every corner of the globe, Marketplace Africa, Asia, Europe, and Middle East.
They've been coming across sniper fire, gunfire. You can see how intense it is.
We have to wrap it up right now.
They feel like they won't be able to outrun the war.
They thought the whole border was open.
These doctors have nerves of steel. You can't help but be struck by how interconnected our world is.
Arwa Damon, CNN.
We are monitoring all of the developments out of the NATO summit in Brussels, but there is also breaking news on Russia's war in Ukraine we want to get to. A senior U.S. official now says that Ukrainian forces have pushed Russian forces back from Kyiv by more than 15 miles. And also, check out this video. Ukraine's military says that it destroyed this Russian ship in a southern port city. CNN's Phil Black, live in Lviv, Ukraine, for us this hour. Phil, let's start with what's happening in Kyiv. What have the Ukrainians been able to do?
So it's been a trend over the last couple of days, Kate, really. Increased reports of Ukrainians not just defending, but now counter-attacking, fighting back, working to regain control of territory that the Russians had previously conquered. And you're right, a US Defense Department official has said that they've made really good progress to the east of Kyiv in one day. Reclaiming some 15 to 22 miles is the estimate. Now, the Ukrainians haven't confirmed those gains specifically, but they have talked about making other gains to the west of the city and to the northwest as well. It's all important because it all slows down, could perhaps even stop Russia's efforts to encircle the capital. This morning, in the port city of Berdyansk, there was another example of Ukrainians fighting back, and in a pretty spectacular way too. That's the destruction of this Russian large landing vessel, the Orsk. It exploded around 7 a.m. This morning in such a way that it damaged two other Russian naval vessels and also destroyed a fuel tank. A fire apparently took hold in a weapons depot, and so the video is quite spectacular because you see these series of explosions that follow the initial blast. The Ukrainians haven't revealed just how they were able to achieve this, what military capability they deployed to destroy a Russian naval vessel in a port that has been controlled by the Russian military from the very earliest days of this war. And finally, Kate, I'd like to talk about a percentage, a figure that goes some way towards explaining the scale of the humanitarian disaster that is still unfolding in this country. UNICEF, the UN's child protection organization, says that 50% of children in this country have been displaced. That means half the children in this country, half the children in Ukraine have been forced to flee their homes because of the war. They describe it as an unprecedented crisis in modern history and one that will only get worse unless the war ends soon. Kate.
Phil, thank you so much for hitting on that and highlighting that, because military wins and losses is one thing. The humanitarian crisis is unprecedented, and as we were watching it unfold. Thank you, Phil, so much for that. Joining me now for more on this is CNN military analyst Lieutenant General Mark Hertling and CNN national security analyst and former Deputy Director of National Intelligence, Beth Sanner. General, let's start where Phil started off, this fight in Kyiv. He was saying if, as a defense official tells CNN, that to the east of the city, Ukrainians have managed to push Russian forces back some 15, 20 miles in really just a day. And then to the northeast, you have Russian forces kind of, quote unquote, digging in. Where does and what does this say about the fight right now?
Well, it's an important fight, first of all, Kate. It's a critically important one because capturing Kyiv was Mr. Putin's primary objective. But I would suggest that the Ukrainian forces have been masterful in their tactics and their actions on the battlefield. This is more than just pushing people back. I wouldn't want to give that a kind of scenario that it's just fighting back and forth. Ukrainians flooded the area with the Irpin River. They trapped the Russian forces in there. They eliminated their supply convoys. And now we've got something, and I'm going to introduce a term to you called the Bucha Gap, because it's around a town called Bucha. This is something like the Fillet Pocket of World War II. They have the potential of capturing or destroying close to 10,000 Russian troops in this one area. That would be actually an entire combined arms army, because the Ukrainians have not only pushed them back, they've surrounded them. And the Russians can't get resupplies into that area. The thing that's most important about this is they've pushed them back far enough that they can't, they're out of artillery range of the city of Kyiv. So the Russians cannot do long distance fires against Kyiv like they've done at so many other major cities that's caused such catastrophe and human suffering.
Which is why, as you point out, it's a critical development here. Beth, this is all happening as we've been talking in the last block with Wolf, with NATO leaders are meeting, G7 leaders meeting. President Zelensky made a direct appeal to NATO leaders today, asking very specifically for more firepower. I mean, the way he put it is, give us just 1% of what you have, he said. I mean, what do you think of that request, and what options are realistically being considered by NATO leaders now?
Well, President Zelensky is being, I think it is masterful how he has also been really pushing on not just the emotional, but the moral heartstrings of the NATO leaders. And there's reason for that. You know, they really do need additional firepower. He did not repeat the no-fly zone request, but he did double down on requesting the fighter jets. And he said, you know, Ukraine is waiting, and we're waiting for real action, and we're waiting for security guarantees. And I think that security guarantees issue also gets into the end game of how to have a peaceful negotiation that will end this war. But in the meantime, you know, the air defenses are really the key. And after Zelensky's appeal, they also started talking about providing anti-ship weapons so they could repeat what we've just seen in the video about Berdyansk. But the problem is it takes a lot of effort to put in these really large weapon systems. So the flow, you know, we really just need to see a lot quicker delivery as much as possible, but it is not easy.
That's a great point. General, can you weigh in on that really amazing video of that Russian warship in Berdyansk? You called it a critical blow. Why?
Well, first of all, there's a significant amount of ammunition, equipment, and perhaps personnel on that ship. That is what's called an LST, a landing ship troop. So it actually unloads a lot of things on shore that is required in the battle. When you see a ship of that size being blown up like that and affecting other ships in a harbor, that's going to, again, significantly affect the capabilities of a logistics resupply, a personnel reboot, all of the things that the Russians need in the south. They have been very successful in resupplying themselves in the southern area of this fight because they have the ports around Crimea. This will be a significant, really disaster for the Russian forces because they're trying desperately to continue to push out of the area. When you can affect the supplies this way, the resupplies, you've affected the fight. And that's what's causing all the so-called stalling that we've been talking about for the Russian troops. They are on what's called an operational pause. It's not a planned pause, it's a forced pause because they right now cannot go any further.
General, it's great to see you. Beth, great to see you. Thank you very much. Coming up for us, what concrete actions will come from today's extraordinary series of meetings of world leaders on the war in Ukraine? That is a huge question. We're going to get back to Brussels. Wolf Blitzer, standing by live.
The Dangote Group stands at the forefront of African enterprise. Since 1978, we've touched the lives of millions of people by meeting their basic needs. Our belief in the promise of Africa has taken us into 14 African countries, with substantial investments that will propel the continent towards greater prosperity, promising jobs, improved standards of living, and economic growth. Dangote, for an empowered Africa.
One of the things that we came to realize during this pandemic is how unprepared we are to be able to address a crisis like this. We see that the world is very fragile. Supply chains are very fragile. So I think one of the positives that might come from this is that after the pandemic is over and we reflect upon what we've learned, we can perhaps put systems and procedures in place to ensure that the workers around the world are protected and to have the private sector be an active part of that process. We had 0.5% of the victims in the world being helped. That means with all of the government, United Nations, and private sector organizations combined, we're not even hitting 1%. In order for us to change that, we need to get the private sector, civil society, governments all working together in a positive, supportive way to address this issue. We have to be united because what we're dealing with here is one of the most horrific crimes you can possibly imagine. So the Mekong Club is working with civil society, the private sector, and other organizations to bring about this outcome. And perhaps as a result of this, we can go from 0.5% to 5% or 50% someday as we continue to move forward to address modern slavery.
This is the result of one single blast.
3.3 million Ukrainians have now fled this country.
You don't have to go far to find a family who has been displaced.
We just heard an air raid siren ring out.
We run down to cover. It is hard to imagine life returning here.
In Kiev, Dnipro,
Poland.
This is CNN.
I'm Delia Gallagher in Rome, and this is CNN.
I'm Julia Chatterley. I'll speak to newsmakers, risk takers, and the ultimate game changers.
First Move with Julia Chatterley, weekdays on CNN.
Business is all about making connections. But some connections are easier to make than others. With a CNN Partner Hotel, the world is always at your fingertips. CNN Partner Hotels, connected to your world.
I'm Natasha Bertrand at NATO headquarters in Brussels, and this is CNN.
Breaking news, President Biden and 29 other NATO leaders, they are convening here at a major summit at NATO headquarters in Brussels. The focus, of course, Russia's war, the brutal war launched against Ukraine. The president also has been meeting with G7 leaders this hour here at NATO headquarters as well. And later, the president will hold a separate round of talks with leaders from other G7 European Council members. And then he'll wrap it all up with a major news conference later this afternoon. We will, of course, have live coverage of that news conference. We're all anxious to hear what President Biden has to say. But let's discuss what's going on right now with two special guests. Ian Brzezinski is the former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Europe and NATO policy. Also with us, Mark Jacobson. He's the former Deputy NATO Advisor, Senior Civilian Advisor to various representatives, including General Petraeus when he was the Supreme Allied Commander. Ian, let's talk a little bit about what's going on. You said that NATO needs to be going going much further right now, far more aggressively to help Ukraine deal with this current situation. Give us an example of what you have in mind.
Well, thanks, Wolf. I mean, this has been a powerful summit. It's brought together the combined power of NATO, the EU, and the G7. So that basically puts on the table the full spectrum of the Western community democracies, diplomatic, military, and economic power. And the messaging has been powerful. Strong call on Putin to immediately withdraw from Ukraine, expression of support for Ukraine. But, you know, it's messaging, and messaging is only going to resonate effectively with Putin if it's backed up by action. And so areas that need serious consideration or decision on is actually expanding the spectrum of economic sanctions to make it a full trade embargo, particularly on oil and gas. That has to be ratcheted up. Last year, Putin or Russia brought in some $489 billion of revenues from sales of oil and gas. That's over $1 billion a day. And even though that's reduced today, those sales continue. So every week, Putin is receiving billions of dollars are used to fuel this invasion. That has to stop. On the NATO front, NATO has to institutionally be more involved in this crisis. First, it should be part of the process facilitating the flow of assistance. And I actually think NATO should actually have a presence in Ukraine. And I'm among those who believe that there should be a humanitarian no-conflict zone established in Western Ukraine. A presence like that would provide safe haven for the millions of refugees that have been generated by Putin's brutal invasion. It would provide territorial perpetuation of the Ukrainian state. It would allow Ukrainian forces to concentrate more effectively against the Russians. And it would be an action that demonstrates the West's resolve in a way that Putin would understand through decisive action.
Well, those are important points indeed. And Mark, you say that NATO can't be the only group standing up to Putin right now. You say, for example, that both India and China are crucial in trying to rein in Russia and what it's doing in Ukraine right now. Explain what you think.
So I agree with Ian in terms of NATO needing to get more involved across the spectrum. I also am worried that a direct military confrontation with the Russians is in no one's interest. I do believe that we need to put some more pressure on the Chinese and on the Indians to put their own economic pressure and diplomatic pressure on the Russians as well. Now, I'm not confident that Putin will listen to anyone, but at the same time, we're really running out of additional actions we can do in the non-kinetic space. In other words, the diplomatic, the economic, and the informational arena. Now, that said, I'm really heartened by the fact that the G7 and the EU and NATO are all acting in concert together. And the last piece that has to happen, if we want to be effective, is to be ready to do this over the long term. These can't be sanctions that are lifted as soon as it's painful for European or North American populations. But again, I think there has to be some diplomatic pressure. Maybe it even comes from additional African nations that are still willing to do business with the Russians. Maybe it comes from Brazil, but I think India and China, above all else, have to be encouraged to get Putin to stop what he's doing.
Yeah, well, let's see if they do that. So far, they have paused, to put it mildly. You know, Ian, the whole nature of what's going on right now, what is of real serious concern to the highest officials in the Biden administration and now NATO itself, is that Putin and the Russians might actually use weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, or maybe even tactical nuclear weapons. Is that at all realistic, you think?
I think it's something that cannot be discounted, particularly in light of Putin's history. He has used chemical weapons before. He supported its use, executed its use in Syria. He's used it for assassination in Europe. And we have intelligence that's been released by the administration, the Biden administration, indicating that they were contemplating false flag operations involving chemical weapons. So this is a serious concern. And I'm glad that the administration set up tiger teams to consider different contingencies. But I have to say, if we're really worried about the use of such weapons of mass destruction, particularly in the chem and bio side, as was emphasized in the NATO statement, and we're determined to deter its use, the most effective way is through some sort of Western presence in Ukraine. I think Putin is more likely to use such weapons against a Ukraine that's isolated on its own, and is less likely to use it if there are Western forces present on the battlefield. Not necessarily engaging Russia in a fight, but present in Western Ukraine, for example, in a humanitarian no-conflict zone.
Ian Brzezinski and Mark Jacobson, guys, thank you very much. We will, of course, continue this conversation down the road. Coming up, as Western leaders meet here at NATO headquarters in Brussels about the war in Ukraine, another major development unfolding around the world. North Korea fires a long-range missile that potentially could be capable of actually reaching the United States. We have details. We'll have a live report when we come back.
Christiane Amanpour in Amsterdam, Jerusalem, Sarajevo, Afghanistan. I'm Christiane Amanpour in Iran. Christiane Amanpour, CNN, with elements of the Galilee division in Israel.
As dusk fell, people were still marching.
Here we are in Habila, a village that has not had any food distribution since June. When the families have finished looking at the names that are posted on those boards, they come here. This is now a memorial to the victims of the Srebrenica massacre. We're very interested to see what's going on here.
Mr. President, it's a privilege to address you from Sarajevo.
Do you not think that the constant flip-flops of your administration on the issue of Bosnia sets a very dangerous precedent? This is a pretty shocking picture. Would you condemn President Assad for 100,000 plus deaths? You still have huge dreams. They didn't take that away from you. In a matter of 26 days, legislation was passed. I wonder whether you ever think that other countries can learn from what you did. What made you be so passionate about the environment? I saw you listening to that testimony. You look pretty broken up yourself. Does love have a chance still of winning?
I always believe that.
No one voice is better or more important than another. We need everybody. One of the things that we always say is that we want to tell the world that slavery still exists, but in order to do that, we need everybody to tell their world. My name is Jenny Brown, and I'm the campaign director of the End It movement. Shine a Light on Slavery Day is a day that we pick each year. It's typically in the month of February, and it's a time for us to really own the conversation for freedom. We ask everybody to join with us by drawing a red X on their hand, or putting a pin on, or some apparel, whatever's appropriate, and then posting about it on social media, and just going about your day having conversations to let people know that slavery still exists. We have heard story after story of lawmakers hearing about it because they saw a bunch of pictures on social media of people with red X's and wanted to learn more. And it caused them to want to do things like creating global funds that made resources and funding available for different partners around the world. On Shine a Light on Slavery Day, we really hope to see people from all walks of life, from celebrities and influencers and professional athletes to politicians to soccer moms and college students. We feel like this really is just a human issue, and it's going to take everybody on board across the world in order to make a dent and to really truly bring freedom to the 40 million men, women, and children trapped in slavery around the world today.
We'll get back to the series of summits underway among world leaders on the war in Ukraine in just a moment. Also developing this morning, North Korea fired its longest missile test yet, launching a suspected intercontinental ballistic missile for the first time since 2017. CNN's Will Ripley is live in Taipei with more on this. Will, how seriously are people taking this test?
Well, President Biden just met with the Japanese prime minister, who was very strong in his wording about this, saying that it was reckless and unacceptable. Of course, this ICBM, believed to be a new kind of ICBM, possibly called the Hwasong-17, it landed very close to Japan's northern island of Hokkaido, inside that country's exclusive economic zone, the waters immediately around it. They say that it posed a danger to ships and planes because North Korea conducted this intercontinental ballistic missile test without any warning. And this missile has really outperformed any other ICBM that North Korea has tested. The last test, of course, was in November of 2017. This time around, it went higher, 3,800 miles. It went longer, 671 miles, and it flew for a longer period of time as well, for 71 minutes. 71 minutes. But by going to that high altitude of more than 3,800 miles, Kate, the North Koreans essentially demonstrated that this missile could hit anywhere in the world, including any city in the U.S., delivering potentially a nuclear warhead that could cause a lot of death and destruction. Of course, North Korea deliberately sending this message on purpose at a time that the world is focused on Ukraine, but all the leaders are gathered there in Brussels, Kate.
Absolutely. Will, thank you so much for that. Let's turn back to Ukraine. Today marks 1 month since Russia's invasion began. Every day, more images show the devastation of the Russian attacks on the cities of Ukraine and on the people. From destroyed homes in Kyiv to the bombing of the maternity and children's hospital in Mariupol, and now in Chernihiv, where new video shows the destruction just left behind after weeks of Russian shelling. This morning, my colleague John Berman, he spoke with a 15-year-old teenager from that city. He was forced from his home, barely escaped the city with his life, and lost his mother at the very same time. Listen to this.
1 second and I see a yellow explosion. Sound in ears, and I just remember, like, I woke up in road, I see the broken car, and I see like my mother going in fire. My mother was ще була жива тоді, коли горіла.
My mother was still alive while she was on fire.
Я почав повзти з дороги.
I started crawling away from the road, and then I felt a pain in my left clavicle.
Yeah, I have a broken. I feel blood in my left ear. Then I hear shooting, not from weapons, rockets or something. And I climb to stairs and hide here. I screaming one time, 2 minutes or 3. It was very cold. I just be in socks.
You can't walk.
Can't walk. And some peoples in village hear the explosion. And these people take us to his house. Накрили нас ковдрами.
They wrapped us in blankets.
And your mother during this? Where?
Загинула, вона на місці загинула, вона згоріла, що вона...
She died at that location, and she was still alive when she caught the fire, when my clothes caught the fire, and she just burned.
When doctors drive me about the hospital, I looking for some people from territorial defense or police to find my father.
You and your father, are you okay in your hearts?
Father is hard. You understand, your wife is dead and you look to your son. I can't stand up without you understand. I think до мене ще повністю не дійшло.
And myself, I think I haven't realized everything to its full extent.
What do you want the world to know about your mother?
Що б ти хотів, щоб світ дізнався про тебе?
Sorry.
I'm sorry.
Співчуваю, справді.
Excuse me. Thank you. Хочу знати, що мама була дуже...
I want them to know that my mother was a very beautiful woman.
І любила чистоту і порядок.
She always liked things to be tidy and clean, and my father and I, we always supported, we understood that and supported her. And right now it's very difficult without mother.
She has a beautiful and brave son.
Має дуже красивого і дуже хороброго сина.
And I'm so sorry you've gone through this.
Such a sweet boy. And after all of this, after everything that this boy has been through, this 15-year-old boy says that he plans to, or at least hopes to, return to his hometown once this war is over. Unbelievable. For more information on how you can help the people of Ukraine, go to cnn.com/impact. We'll be right back.
Have you been bitten by the bug of curiosity? This is CNN 10. My name is Carl Azus. I'll be your explainer-in-chief.
Global news.
International relations are the key factors.
Relevant stories.
Everyday people whose action is changing their community.
Complex issues explained.
We're going back to the future.
And 10-second trivia.
You
Right, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz is speaking after holding a meeting with NATO and G7 leaders on Ukraine. I want you to take a listen to what he has to say.
Today's joint declaration of the G7 reflects this. We have imposed severe sanctions, closely coordinated sanctions, and we reacted to this blatant aggression and breach of international law by Russia. And we agree that we will uphold these sanctions as long as necessary and review their effectiveness time and again. These are difficult times, especially for the citizens of Ukraine who are experiencing immeasurable suffering, death and destruction, but for us all in Europe and around the globe. These are difficult times. Our solidarity, we stand in solidarity with the citizens of Ukraine, and we thank them for their brave and heroic fight against the aggressor. And we thank the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, and I thank him for participating in our meeting and his reports on the situation on the ground. Russia has fundamentally broken the values of our post-war order with its aggression. We call on the Russian president to finally agree to a ceasefire and allow humanitarian corridors to protect the civil society. Russian troops must be withdrawn from Ukraine. This is necessary in order to achieve a tenable, sustainable solution of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And we are going to impose our full weight of leading economies to move Russia towards finding and agreeing to a diplomatic solution. All G7 partners have imposed severe and comprehensive sanctions. We committed to fully implement sanctions. The sanctions are effective and have severe repercussions. We all agree that we want to react with further sanctions should this become necessary. This is a strong signal of our determined action. And in the G7, we have to live up to our global responsibility. Our support goes to Ukraine and the neighboring countries. We agree to increase support measures and humanitarian aid. Germany is going to increase humanitarian aid to Ukraine and its neighboring countries to more than 370 million euros. As G7, we demand and we call upon other countries to contribute to humanitarian aid and support. Europe is shouldering a lot, but we need a global effort. Let me also talk about those who are fleeing their home country and need to flee their country. As leading industrial nations, we see it as our duty and obligation to host refugees from Ukraine and protect them. All G7 states see this duty and obligation and want to live up to this. We call upon further nations to host refugees of war. Russia's war against Ukraine has massive repercussions on the availability and prices of raw materials. We all feel the effects when it comes to energy, but also food prices. Against the backdrop of the Russian aggression, it is our aim to become to make sure that we become less dependent on Russia when it comes to our energy supply. And we've been working on this intensively for a long time. For example, we also need to make our energy supply resilient and sustainable, and we want to take further steps within the G7 in order to achieve this. Russia's war has also dramatic repercussions and consequences for the global food supply, way beyond Ukraine. And this is why we need to do everything, and the G7 see this as their obligation. We need to do everything in our power to prevent a famine. The federal government is taking resolute measures, and we provide further additional funds in our fight against hunger and famine. A large share is directed at the World Food Programme of the United Nations. The G7 is part of a range of meetings that illustrate the solidarity with Ukraine and show that we stand united. We as G7 bear responsibility for development in this world. We are willing to live up to this responsibility. I witnessed the G7 as a unity on all pressing and urgent questions and challenges that we need to tackle together. And we're going to continue our work at the summit of the heads of state and government end of June in Elmau in Germany, and we will gather in this format. And of course, as we did today, should this become necessary, we will meet earlier. Thank you very much. Markus Preis, ARD, has a question. My question pertains to the meeting of NATO. The Ukrainian president had very tangible demands for weapons supply. He demanded tanks and anti-ship weapons. Did you discuss this, and are you going to supply other weapons as well and not just the same ones? Thank you for your question. Indeed, a lot has happened. Let me reiterate this. Many countries among the G7, but not just among the G7, have taken decisions and revised their decisions that they've taken for decades, and they decided to supply arms to a war zone. Germany has taken this decision as well, and this is why it is part and parcel to make Ukraine resilient, and its resilience depends on a continued continued supply of weapons and ammunition that it needs to resist. All countries have their own categories. There is no unified line, if you will, or a common line, but it is